Hi, I'm your host Vasco Duarte. Welcome to the Scrum Master Toolbox podcast, where we share tips and tricks from Scrum Masters around the world. Every day, we bring you inspiring answers to important questions that all Scrum Masters face day after day. Hello everybody, welcome to the Team Tuesdays this week with Jesse Houwing. Hi Jesse, welcome back.
Hello.
So Jesse, on Team Tuesday, of course, as the name says, we talk about teams. But before we dive into that, what's the book that most influenced you in your career as a Scrum Master?
So as a Scrum Master, you'd probably expect some Scrum Mastery book about coaching or working with teams or retrospectives. And for me, it all started out with a lot more of the software, the hard software things that were kind of fully language agnostic. So Code Complete was for me a pretty early in my career, a book where a lot of talk was about readability of code, working with making sure that other people were involved in the creation of the code. And it was my first introduction in really working as a team on code and not just as a single person in your corner writing your piece of code because you have a task with your name on it kind of thing. And for me, that was, I found that really, really interesting, all of the practices that it mentioned in there, which is it's a very thick book. It's a fist thick, talking about the creation process of writing good code and anything that's involved with it. And it's actually already quite old. If I take a much more recent book, it probably is the Scrum Pocket Guide by Gunther Verheijen. I've worked with him closely, and he just has a very, how do you say that? He almost has a philosophical approach to the Scrum Master role. I've had my Scrum Master training once from him. I've taken the Scrum Master training multiple times, by the way, but I've been in class with him, and then afterwards, I was like, I still have more questions than I came in when I took the class, and then about 2 or 3 weeks later, my brain had finished processing all the seeds that Gunther had planted into my brain. And his book is similar. He doesn't give very direct answers to certain things, but he just phrases his philosophy, stance on how he believes Scrum should look like. And it's a very, very thin book. It's very, very concise and condensed version, but it's still, I think, about 100 pages thicker than the actual Scrum Guide.
Yeah, the Scrum Guide is very, very thin.
Yeah, and it's getting even thinner, I've heard. So,
absolutely. Well, Great recommendations there. So, Jesse, now we turn our attention to teams and how sometimes they become their own worst enemy. So, share with us a story of a team. Tell us a little bit about their context, but then walk us through the process of that behavior that emerged. How did it emerge? What were the things that were hinting at that? And walk us through that process that we may feel that we are there with you.
All right. So for me, that example is from an example of scale. So I work with a lot of teams at scale, meaning more than one Scrum team working together. And in this organization, at some point, I think we had 17 Scrum teams working together, and I was working with a few of them. Basically, they were working on one big platform. But the question is whether or not those were multiple products. And the whole organization had really been searching for, do we need multiple product owners? Do we need single product owner? Do we need multiple backlogs? Do we need single backlog? And by the time that I came in, they had 17 backlogs, 17 teams, and 17 product owners. Probably a few too many, but having just one would probably also be a problem. Every team was its own little island, and every team was trying to improve their own software delivery process, and every team was measuring their own velocity and their own stakeholder happiness. And it's really interesting how by optimizing at the team level, you can completely forget about optimizing at the whole. So
and even cause problems, right?
Yeah. So we saw some very interesting behavior where we had one team that was battling a P1 production outage of part of their product, and another team saw that, if we don't deploy our change right now, then by the time they get their hot fix onto the acceptance environment will be locked, and then we have to wait a couple of days before we can get our stuff out. So they actually kind of rushed their hotfix until their change onto the acceptance environment, blew up the environment, and therefore they blocked the actual shipping of the hotfix to go to production. And we kind of had discussions with them later about what happened here and how is that possible and how did you ever think that that was a good idea? But they had a deadline and they had kind of stakeholders that they had agreements on.
Yeah, they also had a deadline. It wasn't a P1 outage, but it was a deadline, right?
Yeah, and it wasn't their P1. It was the P1 of the other team, and it's really interesting to kind of see how these kind of things start to happen once people are kind of measured and awarded for the wrong kinds of metrics kind of in the organization. And it started kind of very, very small, but then we started looking, and we found many more of these kind of interesting things where there were a few teams that reported their price per story point. Basically, they looked at the total cost of their team and then divided it by the velocity that they delivered. And then one of their stakeholders that kind of was always really looking at it, kind of if it was going up or down, and wanted to have kind of explanations on why they were the team was becoming more expensive or becoming less expensive. And at some point, I just walked into a room and they were sitting there estimating the number of story points that the bugs that they had fixed in that sprint would have been had they estimated them beforehand. Because if they would estimate them before the end of the sprint, then the total number of story points that they would get delivered would go up, and then the price per story point would go down. And they were actually spending 9 people in a room estimating story points for something that had already been delivered, while all of those 9 people could spend the same 4 hours delivering actual valuable stuff.
So what that story kind of reminds me is that for some reason, for that team, the focus was not to deliver value to customers, but it was rather to keep a certain price per story point on everything they delivered.
Yeah, because it was very difficult for them to actually measure the value that they were delivering. Especially once you're 17 teams in one big platform, it becomes hard if you don't have all of the kind of tooling in place to measure the real value of the things that you deliver. So it was kind of their proxy for, basically Velocity became their proxy for doing the right thing, and having stakeholders that were kind of even micromanaging on that just made it far, far worse. We had some very interesting discussions later kind of with those teams on where the perception came from and why they thought it was important. And then later we had discussions with the same stakeholders, and they kind of didn't see that their questions led to that kind of behavior. But it's really, really interesting kind of how these small questions, these small kind of seeds that people get planted into their brains lead to these weird behaviors kind of later on. Sometimes even years later, kind of still kind of manage to reappear. It's really kind of strange how that happens.
So you said something, perhaps a little bit of commentary around would be useful. Velocity became the proxy for doing the right thing. Break it down for us. What does that mean from that team's perspective?
Well, they were trying to figure out how they could measure that they were doing the right thing. And they had a number of things that they were looking at, kind of the number of bugs that they were kind of solving and the number of bugs that they were producing. And but people generally, they don't want to have any bugs. And of course, every bug must be fixed quickly. But if you start delivering fewer bugs, then it loses its value as kind of a metric. And they were looking at ways to kind of stand out in the organization as ways to show that they were actually contributing to the whole. And just looking at the number of product backlog items or stories or features that you were delivering kind of felt odd, because you could have small things and you could have big things, and basically they somehow want to kind of have more recognition for the big things that they delivered. So they started to kind of look at the average size of things, which in their case was expressed in story points and therefore in kind of the total velocity. And velocity therefore became a very, very important kind of metric for them that actually represented to that team how much value they were producing, kind of irregardless of the ability to measure how much value they were actually producing. So it became their proxy, their alternate metric to help them see whether or not they were doing the right thing.
Which, of course, if you look at it, a few months later and you make it clear that velocity isn't value, then they'll probably agree, yeah, that's probably the wrong metric. But if you start aiming towards defining and measuring value slowly, and then you start to kind of, okay, so if this is bigger, does it have more value? Yeah, maybe. Okay, so story points might be something worth measuring. And if you do this slowly, you end up with the wrong metric and thinking perfectly that it's the right metric and perhaps the most important one.
And think about it, in many organizations, if you deliver something big, that change will be seen by many people and you will get applauded by many people. If you deliver many small things, all of those might get unnoticed. So delivering many big things tends to kind of give you more reward inside of an organization, especially if they're not really looking at value. It's just you become more visible, and hopefully you're delivering the right things. Because if you're delivering big things and they're wrong, then kind of you gain the wrong kind of visibility. But so the focus became on trying to deliver as many big rocks as you possibly can, while we were all kind of coaching many of the teams towards try to deliver as many small kind of pebbles as you possibly can because of lower risk and faster throughput and better flow and everything else. But you got more noticed in the organization if you delivered a couple of very big things. And you got a lot more kind of reward and visibility and kind of positive reinforcement in the organization than for delivering many small things that might go unnoticed.
Yeah, absolutely. And that reminds us of this idea that we should always look at the dynamics that are in play in the organization, because that will affect how teams react.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that story, Jesse.
You're welcome.
Tuesday is Team Day here on the Scrum Master Toolbox podcast, but tomorrow we talk about something that goes beyond the work we do with the teams. We will talk about how to lead change and what our guests have learned from leading and participating in change programs during their career. See you tomorrow. We really hope you liked our show. And if you did, why not rate this podcast on Stitcher or iTunes? Share this podcast and let other Scrum Masters know about this valuable resource for their work. Remember that sharing is caring.